Yes, please.
Like the vertical notices and first reading of bills. It's a new bill that
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. This sitting is resumed.
government notices recommitted.
Honorable Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice of the remediation agreements, deferred prosecutions bill 2020.
First reading of bills recommitted.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the first reading of the remediation agreements, deferred prosecutions bill 2020.
The question that the aforementioned bill be read here first time. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Me think the ayes have it. Government business is resumed. Honorable member for St. Joseph.
Mr. Speaker, the last few days have thrown all of us, individuals, countries, into very deep reflection. Some of us will have been reflecting on the past, others of us reflecting on the present, but all of us reflecting on the future. There's no doubt, sir, that these are uncertain times. Uncertain times because I suspect that the average age of parliamentarian is probably I'm being prompted, sir, to say 30. And you would know that it's the ladies in the chamber that are nudging me in that direction, sir. But I think it is safe to say that nobody in this chamber was born at the time of World War II. Perhaps the oldest of us in this chamber will have been born just after. And, Mr. Speaker, as I try to think about the challenges that the world is facing today, I can more easily identify historically with world wars. Not because of the loss of life, but because of the way in which those occurrences transform the day-to-day existence of humanity, and even, sir, the day-to-day existence of Barbadians, because history tells us that at the time of World War II, the average Barbadian experienced severe hardship through shortage of commodities, shortages of food, And I'm reminded, sir, that in that day, laws were passed by the parliament of that day that 12% of all agricultural land had to be planted in food crops or to supplement the availability of foodstuff in Barbados because shipping had shut down. Shipping is almost again shut down. Mr. Speaker, COVID is not in any way like a world war, but in many respects it has begun to change the lives of humanity, and more importantly to us, the lives of Barbadians. It has begun to change the way in which we live, and it has begun to change our very outlook on the lives that we live. Mr. Speaker, we have all been fed a diet of science fiction movies in the 70s and 80s and science fiction books. We had Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. We had numerous other movies, Terminator. Many of them presented a dystopian future, sir, a future filled with misery, disease, and deprivation. And we recognize that those were just movies. I don't think any of us army personnel in the streets, food unavailable. I suspect every member of this chamber has seen Times Square. And at no time of the day or night has Times Square ever been without masses of humanity celebrating life and wealth and health. The city that never sleeps. And that city now, sir, is asleep. Mr. Speaker, and to think that those things have all happened in the last 3 weeks. At Christmas, while we had heard of COVID, we had no thought of mere 3 months later waking up to such a different world. In 1915, Mr. Speaker, the plague called the Spanish flu killed 50 million people. Before that, sir, the Black Death in the 1300s killed 200 million people. 150 years ago, something called cholera wiped out a quarter of Barbados' population. And in our lifetime, sir, AIDS has killed around 32 million people. And in the last 10 years, we've had SARS, we've had H1N1, we had more outbreaks than you could shake a stick at. And we survived every single one of them. But there is something about COVID, Mr. Speaker, that has cast a pall on the entire world. People are now compelled to stay at home. People have to live lives that are very different to the life that they led just 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I can't quite identify what it is about COVID. It sounds like a new name. We went from Dale and John and Cynthia to Kamisha and all kinds of other names. And if COVID was not such a sinister thing, it would remind you of the name Ovid, a famous poet of years gone by. So I can't say what there is about COVID that has caused us to begin to panic and to retreat into our shells. I don't know, sir. Maybe it is because COVID has turned out to be the great leveler. It is afflicting rich and poor. It's afflicting black and white, whether you live in the north or in the south. Maybe it is because it has threatened to bring the world's money-making machines to an end. I don't think any of us could have imagined a world where you could not get on a plane to Miami, or you could not go and see a relative in England, or that they could not see you. But in this brave world, sir, it doesn't matter how much money you have, because all of us, from the most successful lawyer to the lowliest gardener, he cannot get a flight from here to New York, because there is no flight from here to New York. That is a leveler, sir. That brings us all to a place where we recognize that there's more that makes us similar than different. So in my lifetime, sir, I really can't say that I know of anything that has so quickly changed how we relate to each other, how we live, and how we work. In just a few days, we've begun to experience job losses in Barbados. And not because of anything that we did, not because of anything that we failed to do, not because we have made our economy uncompetitive, not because of anything that the OECD did or the FATF did or the WTO did, sir. Nothing of the sort. What confronts us is the fallout of this illness. And sir, the planes that don't fly and the drop in the stock market and the businesses that have ground to a halt and the shopping malls, sir, those are just the commercial side of things. There's also the human side of things. Mr. Speaker, we have now begun to rethink what it means when we said that man is a social animal. Every construct of humanity says that we come together. If you are a person who believes in evolution, you would conceive of a time when ancient man or prehistoric man began to come together for purposes of cooperation, whether it was hunting and companionship. And if you are not a believer in evolution, you would perhaps think of ancient man coming together as families to live and work and to raise cattle. And in New Testament times, you would think of people coming together for churches. But that notion of man as a social being has changed. There used to be a time when a handshake meant something, and now we've replaced the handshake by the elbow bump, the foot bump. And none of those two things cause you to look in your eye, which was the essential element of a handshake. And the military people would tell you that, I think they said the origin of the handshake was when combatants came together so as to ensure that the one could not turn and attack the other. They reached out and they held each other's dominant hand because they couldn't attack from the left. So we now have a world survey. I now have to look at my son, whom I have been chastising for years. When he approached me and held out his fist and did so to bump, I said, son, no, I am from that era. You gotta shake my hand and look me in the eye. And now he holds out his hand, and a docile and penitent dad responds with a greeting that has filled me with anguish for the longest time. There's a generation of Barbadian who, much like the people that have been anxiously awaiting a hurricane, there's a generation of Barbadians that are somehow excited about the fact that something different is happening and school children get to stay home. But the one thing that we can be sure of is that this pestilence will pass. I cannot imagine what it would have been like to live in a country where we were burying even the living people. But the Barbadian historians reflect that in the 1850s or 1854, when we had the outbreak of cholera, as I said, quarter of the Barbadian population was wiped out. Apparently, when the people who were brave enough to accept the job as grave diggers and buriers of bodies, they would sometimes pick up people who had been so ill that they had just gone into a coma. But it didn't matter to them. You weren't moving, so you were buried. Sir, the point is that none of us can understand what that's like. But that is not what COVID is. The one thing that we can be sure of is that we know more about COVID as a disease in the last 3 months than mankind knew about AIDS in 5 or 10 years. At the time when those famous pestilences were wiping out people day after day, they were dying because the health care that is available now was not available then. And I'm pessimistic about many things, Mr. Speaker, many things. But I am not filled with despair about our future, because I'm confident that this too will pass. After 1914, after World War I, William Butler Yeats, a famous poet, wrote a poem called The Second Coming, and it is famous for a simple line. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm not going to read any of it, but it's more famous for the line, "Things fall apart." And he was reflecting on the world at that time. And look where we came to since then. Where does that leave us, sir? In September of last year, my ministry began to work on our estimates. And all of our ministries began to work on our estimates. And we understand the beautiful simplicity of that exercise. As ministers, we're responsible for determining a program that our ministry will execute. We try to work out what the cost of that program will be. Finance chops it for us by 10%, if we're lucky. And then, sir, once our estimates are passed in this honorable place, we set about for the following 12 months carrying out that program. And when we started on that exercise last September, we had in mind what money would be available in the Treasury. In other words, we had in mind the kind of money that we would have available to spend. We knew what we intended to commit government's resources to. And all of those calculations were predicated on a few, to me, simple assumptions. Almost, sir, like the assumptions that each of us make when we decide to take a mortgage to buy a car, a home, or take a loan to buy a car. It's predicated simply on how much money you have coming in and how much you have available. I don't think it's any more complex than that. But today, we have to acknowledge that all of the presumptions and assumptions that we made when we prepared those estimates are now largely irrelevant. Our estimates were prepared on the assumption that businesses in Barbados would be able to flourish to a minimum level and contribute a minimum amount of money in taxation to our treasury. Our estimates were prepared on the basis that a sufficient number of Barbadians would be employed and who would pay income tax to the treasury. It was predicated on a certain level of tourism arrivals. I would not want to be the Minister of Tourism. Wouldn't want to be the Minister of Tourism. Or maybe I would, because for the next few months, I don't think we can expect any tourism at all. So we worked out our figures based on these things, and today, sir, as the exercise has unfolded since the 23rd of February, when we started this debate, we've seen everything change completely. Now, Mr. Speaker, we could despair. We could. We could bury our heads in the sand. We could adopt a posture of being supine. We could adopt an attitude of, well, there's nothing we can do about that. But I would say, sir, that if that happened, that would not be the Barbados Labour Party that I ran for. That would not be the Barbados Labour Party that has seen this country through even in its darkest times. Even in its darkest times. We can't change what the rest of the world does in response to COVID. We can't stop President Trump from closing his borders or closing his airports or clearing his streets. But what we are responsible for is how we respond to COVID. And it has only been a few days, sir, since our first case was discovered. But I have to say that I am proud of the way in which this administration has responded. It has responded with a sense. It has responded with a sense of urgency, yes, because this situation requires urgency. But at no time in that urgency did we ever lose our sense of humanity and our sense of obligation to the people who elected us to serve. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister will address this chamber very shortly, and it is not for me to outline any of the things that in her expertise as Minister of Finance she proposes to make available to Barbadians to help to see us through this difficult time. But I will say that in our covenant of hope, while we did not contemplate this, we made certain commitments as a party to ourselves and to the people of Barbados that hold true no matter what confronts us. And one of those principles, sir, has always been that the first call on our resources will be dedicated to the safety and security of the citizens. And COVID or not, sir, that has never changed. And I've had meetings with the High Command of the Royal Barbados Police Force to develop a plan which would try to ensure that a minimum level of police resources will be made available to Barbados and Barbadians come what may. Come what may. Because we have to appreciate that in the same way that COVID will affect one set of people, it could affect another. I call it the great leveler. COVID will affect nurses, it will affect doctors, it will affect police, it will affect construction workers, it will affect politicians, it will affect priests. None of us are spared. None of us are guaranteed immunity. And we have to therefore anticipate that in a worst case scenario, a large number of police officers may either develop symptoms or for one reason or another be forced to quarantine for 2 weeks. Now, in the same way that that can wreak havoc in any commercial setting, it can certainly wreak havoc within the members of the Royal Barbados Police Force, within the police force's ranks. And being proactive, we've looked to see how we are going to be able to manage the matter of law enforcement should the worst happen. And I am satisfied, sir, that we have a credible plan, a plan that can work, and a plan that sees us having the necessary resources. Now, there's no doubt that there are some extraordinary things that we're going to have to allocate police officers to, but they've been briefed on those things, and those measures are in place. And the same thing for the Barbados Defense Force, sir. As a member of the National Security Council, I am satisfied that the BDF is in a position not only to support the work of civil society and the work of our civil authorities in these difficult times, but they are also able to continue to carry out their core functions, both as a Coast Guard and as a land force. Mr. Speaker, how we fare over the next days and weeks and months will be determined by how we carry out the plans that are in place. Yes, there's going to be panic. There's going to be panic. There's going to be panic, sir, because none of us know if tomorrow we will be ill. But we do know that even as an illness, there are certain categories, and I'm not a doctor or a pharmacist or a scientist, but my understanding is that there are certain categories of people who are at higher risk, the elderly, those with various illnesses and so on, and the most of us, the vast majority of us, will get through this illness in much the same way as we get through a flu. There are Barbadians who will be questioning already some of the reasons why, as a government, we have done what we've done. There are Barbadians who said that we should have closed our airport weeks ago, that we should have done like England, and we should do like Trump, and we should have done this and should have done that. And I want to remind them, sir, in our small economy, we do not have the luxury of making mistakes. When we take a course of action, we have to be satisfied that it will see us safely to where we need to be. I read the BBC, and now it said that the Barbaros administration is going to pay up to £2,400 to every single Brit who loses their job as a result of COVID for a period of 3 months. Imagine that. £2,400 for every Brit who loses their job because of COVID for a period of 3 months. Now, we don't have those kinds of dollars to play with. We don't have that kind of fiscal space. As the Prime Minister reminds us, we're much better off, we're in a much better position to deal with it now than if COVID had struck when we had first come to government 2 Mays ago. But even with our improved circumstances, even with our foreign reserves, we simply don't have the ability to do those things. And we also have to recognize that when we talk about Barbados as being a whole country, we are not big and bad. When Barbados tries to buy 50 ventilators for individuals who have breathing difficulties, and I know that I'm not putting it in any medical way, but we have to try to find 50. And the New York City is trying to buy 25,000. Now, that may not be the figure. It might only be 12,000. But the point is, our 50 means nothing in the face of an entity that says, I want 25,000. I remember when iPhones first came up, and I appreciate your latitude, sir. When iPhones first came up, I quarreled with Flo because they didn't have the iPhone I wanted. And the fellow told me we was only bringing about 200. I said, so why you can't get 200? He said, listen, we at Flo want 200 phones. AT&T want 2,000 containers. So who can stop producing 2,000 containers to sell flow in Barbados, 200 phones. You can bring them, almost bring them in a suitcase. So as we try to deal with COVID, we are competing with entities, not just countries, entities that have greater spending power than we have and greater ability to attract and to move goods. So yes, it's very easy to say we should have closed the airport, but we had to look at the situation not just clinically but analytically and ask ourselves, if we close the airport, how will we get the few ventilators that we need? How will the sick get their medication? And if we close it, when we're ready to reopen it, who will be looking at us? And we've heard we shouldn't have ships in our port. Now, there's a human side of this. But as Attorney General, I have to reflect on the legal side of it. When we started to attract ships to Barbados for home porting, we took on board certain legal obligations. So it's not just a question of the humanitarian side of things, because, I don't think that Barbadians have reached the point where we are so brutish that we would prefer to see a ship at sea sailing wrong without any sight of land just because there's not proof of, but the possibility of an illness. Only a few weeks ago, there were 45 Beardens on one of those ships. 45 Beardens on one of those ships. Our brothers and our sisters. Well, those people out there have brothers and sisters too. But it's not just the humanity of it, sir. It is the fact that when we said to these entities, we want you to home port in Barbados, it wasn't just about providing water. It wasn't just about providing flour and sugar. But it was because we understood that and we accepted freely that there were obligations to it. And yes, true, we hope that something like this would never happen. But having undertaken those obligations as a sovereign state, we cannot now discard them because it might seem convenient to do so. So every single one of those ships that we have responsibility to home port, we have a contractual obligation to home port them, even at times like this. But what we do is that we satisfy ourselves that in home porting them, there is no risk to Barbados or to Barbadians. Now, sir, it is a difficult time for us. It's a difficult time for us, true. And I am especially aggrieved, Mr. Speaker, because all of St. Joseph, both here and in the diaspora, all of us were readying ourselves for the biggest event ever to have graced these shores since Independence Day so many decades ago. We had everybody hyped up. Jazz on Hackleton's Cliff. Seafood extravaganza compliments the Minister of Maritime Affairs who fixed up Tent Bear Market for us. St. Joseph Alive, a whole host of things, sir. And we've found that we now have to cancel them. Breaks our heart. But so in our meeting last night, we started to ask ourselves, well, was we gathering only about a fete? Or was we gathering deeper than that? Was we gathering about paring away the layers of what it is to be a Barbadian and looking inside to see what being a Bajan meant? Was it about playing dominoes, or was it about reconnecting with our brothers and sisters and finding our sense of community again? And we felt that the larger, more noble purpose to regathering was where the heart was to be found. Not about the fete, but about the humanity. And so, sir, we in St. Joseph have changed regathering to recaring. And I would urge all of you who still have months to go, not to follow me, not to follow St. Joseph, but not to follow me, not to follow St. Joseph, but to follow what must intuitively and instinctively be the greater cause of bringing our people together for this year. Regathering was not about making money. And I urge you to follow our direction and demonstrate, sir, that social distancing is not about being antisocial. To demonstrate, Mr. Speaker, that staying home from work is not about not working. Can I have an amen? TD Jakes now. I get it from my father. To demonstrate, Mr. Speaker, that at this time, a lot of the things that we discarded and forgot long ago on the altar of Xboxes and all those kind of things, Atari and on and on and on, and even mobile phones, a lot of those things that we sacrificed are worth bringing back up. You see, sir, Easter is coming, and I believe that I could still fly a kite without risking infecting somebody with COVID. I believe, sir, I believe that there are still things that we can do which celebrate what being a Barbadian is without putting each other at risk. And so while in St. Joseph we are cancelling our big kite flying event, we have decided to do classes for our young people in kite flying online. And yes, we will still fly those kites, because the one thing you know about flying a kite is that you could never fly a kite too close to another fella. You always needed a certain minimum distance to fly a kite. You need a certain minimum distance to go fishing. You need a certain minimum distance even to play a game of Take Me Two. And I encourage Barbadians to, at this difficult time, rediscover our sense of humanity. Rediscover what it really means to be a Bajan, and also rediscover those days when we were our brother's keeper. And arising out of this, Mr. Speaker, I believe that we will see a kinder, gentler Bajan. A Bajan who, ironically, will use this opportunity to hone his or her technical skills to be able to compete in a world which sees a workplace less in terms of an office, but more in terms of a place where you can apply your talents for earning a living. A place that recognizing that there can be a healthy mix of working flexi time and still achieving the purposes that you need to achieve. Mr. Speaker, I urge businesses, I know that it's a difficult time, but I believe that as a country, as a government, we're asking people to stand up for a lot. And as a government, sir, we have to stand behind them. Difficult days ahead, yes. Difficult days. We've done as much as we can do to prepare, and I believe that we are better prepared than most. It didn't come overnight. In the same way we approached coming to government in 2018, we approached this whole exercise. And it is an exercise that I believe that we will carry through with great success and aplomb. Sir, I am going to close. I know that my colleagues are happy to see me sitting down. But there was a generation of Barbadians, Mr. Speaker, who before independence had some serious tasks ahead of them. They had the task of putting plans and policies in place to deal with a society that had a lot of ills affecting it. They had to deal with education, they had to deal with health. They had a lot of social ills that had to be corrected by a generation of politicians only a few years ago. In later years, it came to the lot of a generation of politicians to deal with the economic ills. Now, sir, we have to deal with a different specter. But in those early years, sir, there was a Barbadian named Hilton Vaughan. And it is a great tragedy that if you Google Hilton Vaughan, you will not see his name anywhere on Google. You're not going to see Hilton Vaughan on any of the search engines. His name does not come up, and believe me, I have searched. But Hilton Vaughan was a Barbadian teacher and a Barbadian poet. And people don't know I have a love for poetry, I do. But as much William Butler Yeats and Percy Bysshe Shelley and other great poets I have read and continue to read, the poem that strikes me the most ever is a poem by Hilton A. Vaughan called To the Unborn Leader. And every time I read this poem, whether to myself or in a place like this, my voice breaks. Because Hilton Vaughan, when he wrote that poem to the unborn leader, he was speaking to a generation of Barbadians not yet with us. And his message was simple, so I will just share it with this chamber. You who may come 100 years after our troubled bones are dust, far-seeing statesmen born to lead and worthiest of the people's trust. Turn these few pages in that hour when by dark doubts you are assailed, of what it boots to shape their power. Read what we won and where we failed. Or barb the word with wisdom fit, and build, oh build where we but dream. Expose, undo, repair, extend, as you, O Master, best may deem. But whatsoever of ours you keep, whatever fades or disappears, above all else, we send you this, the flaming faith of these first years. Sir Hilton Vaughan, when he talks about when by dark doubts you are assailed, I think he was describing how we feel today, how Barbadians feel in their homes, because we recognize as a government that they are assailed by dark doubts. But it becomes the responsibility of this generation to project this poem forward to another 100 years, sir. That's our responsibility. And to say to them, what we do today is the foundation upon which we expect you to build tomorrow. There was a time when Hilton Vaughan had in mind a generation of unborn leaders. And he didn't know, sir, that one of those unborn leaders would be called Mia Motley. He didn't know that one of those unborn leaders would be called Indaware or Trevor Prescott or Ronald Topping. He didn't know that those unborn leaders would go by the name of Marsha Cattle and Kerry Simmons and Kirk Humphrey. He didn't know. But I believe that I stand among a group of people worthy of being called leaders of a country that still has a bright future. It doesn't take an economist, Mr. Speaker, to tell us that if we stand together, that we can succeed. And I was so heartened when I listened to the Minister of Agriculture speak about the importance, not just of agriculture as a national imperative, but the importance of each of us seeing a role that we can play in helping to provide food security, our own food security. I'm not embarrassed to say that I plan on planting some potato slips this weekend. I'm not embarrassed to say that. Well, there's a great chance that I will now have to stay home and fight off the monkeys. But, you know, there's certain disciplines that we all used to have, and that somehow or another we have allowed them to pass out of our grasp because of the convenience of supermarkets and so on. As a little boy, and I believe that the member for St. Thomas well remembers what it was like to be sent to the shop for groceries. And we were speaking in the members' room the other day about going for lard oil and keeping ice water in the fridge, and whether it was a white rum bottle or some other bottle, because there were things that we knew that we had to do in order to maintain our survival. Now, I invite Barbadians not to run away from those things. Right now, we have the luxury of drinking bottled water. Yes, I do. But I know, too, that in this particular period of time, supplies coming out of places like the United States will run short. They will run short. And in another few days, we won't have any bottled water on our shelves. In fact, I am advised that not a shipment of bottled water has left the ports in Florida for the Caribbean in the last 5 days. So, do we not have to go back to that time when we used to pour water in a bottle and put it in the fridge? And you know what? In all of this, we're helping the Minister of the Blue Economy, because we're going to be cutting back on the number of plastics that we're throwing into our dump. And we're going to be helping the Minister of the Environment, because we now have to start taking things like composting and other things like that seriously. We're going to be helping the Minister of Energy, because we will cut down on our driving and our consumption of fossil fuels. I think the scientists have already said that the air above New York City has already begun to show diminishing levels of carbon monoxide and pollution simply because people are driving less. It's unfortunate, Mr. Speaker. It's unfortunate, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful for your latitude, sir.
You've had a tremendous amount of latitude.
I'm afraid I have to trespass on your good nature some more.
You have trespassed and you have trespassed
I have
and you have trespassed.
I have about 4 more poems to read, sir. And at least half a sermon still to deliver. But the point is that, you know, we ought to have been strong enough to say to ourselves a year ago or 2 years ago that we needed to stop doing certain things. And Minister Humphrey had to come to Parliament and pass a law to ban reusable plastics. And look where we are today. Look where we are today. I would bet you that every single person who rushed into Massey in the last few days to buy stuff walked with a bag. Bet you they did. You know, there's nothing like a crisis that would cause people to start to look deep inside and see what resources they can gather. Mr. Speaker, 15 or more years ago, when the Honorable Prime Minister was Minister of Education, in fact, it's more than 15, more like 20 years ago when she was Minister of Education, she piloted a project called EduTech. And at that time, EduTech was intended to provide every single Barbadian student in primary, secondary, and tertiary level with a computer. And we did a lot of work. We transformed schools and we gave them all equipment and training and so on. But somehow EduTech never took flight. Never took flight. But we are now faced with a prospect of having closed schools because of COVID, because of the risks of COVID. We are not able to say when we're going to be able to reopen those schools, because none of us know when this crisis will reach tolerable levels and abate. Sorry, none of us know when this crisis will abate and reach tolerable levels. So what are we to do with our children? Are we to leave them in a state of I don't know, limbo for the next month, into 2 months, into 3 months, or 4 months, or even into 6 months? We can't. So that which we started to deal with 20 plus years ago is facing us in the face once again. And now we have to take serious decisions about the delivery of education to our students through the use of technology. Now, you know, a crisis is what is bringing this about. But out of this crisis will come a tremendous good. Because I can bet you that most of the youngsters who have computers, they're using them to play games and so on, and very few of them are using them as a method of instruction. So this crisis now puts us in a place where we are forced to see how we can use technology in the delivery of education. Now let me say that brings for me a particular satisfaction, because I know that there are large numbers of my constituents who are not able to afford to have wireless at their houses. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I do not have a password on the Wi-Fi at my constituency office. I don't know how many of you do. I don't have a password. Don't have a password on it. Because anybody at any time is entitled to come to my constituency. They don't have to come in. They can sit outside. And anytime you pass Horsell, day or night, you are sure to find people gathering there, and you're sure to find that they're taking the benefit of the wireless. And if we're going to make the delivery of education through technology a viable and exciting prospect, then we also have to make sure that those people who do not currently have access have it. When we started the process of liberalization of telecoms, one of the things that we were considering as being a must was making sure that Barbados had universal access to wireless, and that at a minimum level it would be free. But that too went into abeyance. But we are in a place, sir, where we have to revisit these notions and recognize that they're going to be, or they have the tremendous potential to be the savior of our education system at this difficult time. So, Mr. Speaker, I am not fearful. I am not despairing like William Butler Yeats. I am more optimistic like Hilton Vaughan. because I can see that coming out of this particular crisis, we're going to be able to reap benefits and opportunity. I have confidence, sir, in the plan that this administration, which will shortly be revealed to you, I have confidence in the plan that we have developed. From what I've seen of it, sir, it satisfies the needs of those Barbadians who are going to be greatest at the mercy of this illness. But what it is also doing is allowing us to put certain institutional arrangements in place that are legacy. When we did Cricket World Cup, we talked about legacy because we recognized it was more than World Cup itself. So as we approach the issue of COVID, we are thinking about legacy too. Mr. Speaker, every year at hurricane season, we struggle to see what schools can be made ready. We struggle to see what schools can be made ready as hurricane shelters. We struggle. And only last year we were able to get a modest hurricane, Category 1 hurricane shelter available for St. Joseph, and I think it can only accommodate 14 or 15 people. But we see, once this COVID crisis has passed, that we will have an installation at the naval base that we will never again allow to fall into a state of disrepair, because that too is legacy. So let us go forward together. As I shift from regathering to recaring, I think, sir, that we have an excellent opportunity for Barbadians and for Barbados to build on these dark days and show what a real Barbadian can be like and how much we can achieve. I'm obliged to you.
The leader of government business, having consulted with the leader of the opposition, has humbly requested that the Prime Minister's contribution to the second reading of the Appropriation Bill be telecast live. Given the nature of COVID-19 and the challenges and importance of it, I hereby grant permission for the Prime Minister's contribution to be telecast live. Honorable Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, sir, as I rise in this closing of the second reading of the Appropriation Bill, we do so at a time when the world is in flight. We never imagined when we laid these estimates in February that we would be facing the scale of disruption that the world is now facing. Indeed, nations across the globe have closed their borders. Fear is a genuine emotion to have at this time, but with understanding and effective leadership at all levels of our society, I believe we can overcome it. But what we have is a continuous feeding of the fear, largely as a result of the technology that we have so celebrated hitherto, but technology that is reinforcing in people anxieties that are not necessarily leading to the strongest and best behavior. We live in a world today now where in this region, for sure, highly dependent tourism economies are now facing the reality that many of the businesses will have to face temporary closure. And some are hoping that that temporary closure will not become permanent closure. We live in a world today where we reflect that as a Caribbean region, we face multiple vulnerabilities. While we struggle to battle the oncoming pandemic within our shores, we also face the reality that in just over 2 months, the hurricane season will start. And for those who also have understood that the hurricane is not the only example or only consequence of the climate crisis, we will now recognize as well that it is compounded by the groundwater crisis that we face in many of our countries, and indeed the onset of sargassum weed that has compromised the earning capacity of many of our coastal establishments, be they hotels or be they otherwise attractions that earn and employ our citizens to be able to sustain their families. I said the world is in flight. The United States stock market, that great barometer of fear and greed, has fallen by 40% in less than 40 days. And day after day, we have seen some of the biggest point declines in stock market indices. We live in a world today where, and even though this may benefit Barbados initially, its benefit to us is so limited, but its damage to our neighbors is so serious that it is of concern to us. And I refer, of course, to the decline in oil prices that we are also confronting in today's reality. The only thing perhaps certain about today is that nothing is certain. The only thing certain about today is that nothing is certain. In the morning when I wake up, sir, I must confess to you that at least on 1 or 2 occasions I have pinched myself to remind myself that this is now our lived reality and it is not a sci-fi movie or a horror movie, more appropriately, that we are watching. But I also then immediately reflect that I wonder how Pierce Stappen would have felt in 1914, 15. My grandfather, he left here to go to Washington, D.C., supposedly to study law at Howard, but he was a rebel in his own way and determined that the law was not for him, and he became a professional photographer. But he left there to come back home just as World War I was becoming too difficult. And even in coming back home, he would have realized that the pressures placed on a small country, his island like this, would have meant serious hardship for all those who lived here at the time. He was traveling across the region with my grandmother. They had children in different islands, 2 born in Guadeloupe, 2 born in Barbados before they left, 1 born in St. Martin, my mother and 2 others born in Aruba. 8 children they had. But they raised those 8 children through World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. I could think perhaps of my other grandfather, who was a pupil teacher at St. Matthew's School, who worked in bakeries, who left Barbados to go to the United States for a better life in the 1930s, only to be confronted equally by the Great Depression and the consequences that it had in that nation. And he too returned because he believed that he could make a better life for he and ultimately his family in this rock of ours. I start there because we have, as a nation, to understand that if you asked yourself where your grandparents or great-grandparents were and understood the tribulations and the trials that they went through, then we better understand that no one promised us a rose garden. And that ours is a life that must know how to manipulate the heights and the lows, the mountains and the valleys. The truth is that even before our grandparents and great-grandparents, we go 2 or 3 generations back, and they faced untold horror. I start from this point because there is nothing that is going to defeat this nation or the people of this country or this region. Nothing. And in all that we do, Barbados must stand as one, because Barbados's legacy has been one, and one not only O-N-E, but W-O-N. Our progress has been won by there being a unifying philosophy, irrespective of political parties, irrespective of factors of production, for want of a better phrase, that even those who owned capital in this country in the last 70 years have come to understand that they cannot divorce themselves from the progress of ordinary Barbadians, in particular labor, who have built this country not just in the last 70 years, but from the time of its modern settlement, first as beasts of burden, second as exploitative factors, particularly in the context of the post-emancipation movement, and finally as free citizens, not with much, but with great aspiration, great resolve, and great ability. And I start from this point because, in a very real sense, how we move from here to face what is before us requires that we stand tall, that we breathe deep, and that we commit ourselves to understanding that no single person working alone, no single entity working alone can achieve what is necessary to bring us to safe ground. I therefore want to thank the social partnership of this country first and foremost, who from the 28th of May in our first meeting has risen to the challenge on every occasion that the country's stability and survival has been put at risk. I want to thank the leader of the opposition and the members of his party. I want to thank the leader of the Democratic Labour Party and her members. I want to thank the church, because over the course of the last few weeks, I have had cause as Prime Minister of this country to reach out to each and every one of them. And without fear of contradiction, I say at the outset of this debate, I am proud to be the Prime Minister of Barbados today. And I say so because, for the most part, we are moving in the same direction as one Barbados, ready for whatever comes our way and ready to hold each other up, because this is the Barbadian way. Mr. Speaker, we have made significant progress with our recovery and transformational plan today. And it bears repetition, even though much of what we will face will threaten to destabilize it. Sir, the current crisis undermines the importance of having an adequate stock of reserves. When we came into office, the reserves of this country stood at just over $420 million. And I say so not as an act of condemnation today, but as an act of our reality. And we have been able to build it back up substantially. We knew that if we had been plunged into a global crisis then, we would have been in serious trouble. As Bearden would say, we would have been in Potter. And why? Because that $420 million barely represented 5 weeks of import cover. And within 2 weeks of coming into office, we would have had to pay down almost $100 million of it in debt service payments, leaving us then with 320 before we would even have settled into our offices properly. And had that happened, and we went into a hurricane season, in the end we had Tropical Storm Kirk, which was not as bad and certainly not as good as the real Kirk. But we had $320 million, or we would have had $320 million to face the hurricane season. A country that must face crises, whether man-made, economic, or natural disaster, must have sufficient reserve cover like ours, where more than 60% of what we use is imported. And if you don't have the import cover, sir, you can't pay for the goods. We knew it because in 1991 we had been reduced to 1 week of import cover. Today, as I speak to you, our reserves stood at $1,563 million. $1,563 million. We went from 5 weeks of imports to 5.5 months of imports today as I stand before this honorable chamber. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, it isn't only that. That reserve cover for the rainy day allows us to be able to plan out the package that I would want to announce here today, the Phase 1 package. Because if we didn't have it, I wouldn't be able to have the flexibility to do the things that we are now about to do to help save the Barbadian people as we go into this woeful and awesome crisis. In addition, sir, to our reserves at $1.56 billion, I have a duty to report to this honorable chamber that the Inter-American Development Bank just over 1 week ago, their board agreed to a sustainability policy-based loan, one of its first types, for the sum of $160 million. And those funds will come into Barbados sometime over the next few weeks to be able to boost that import cover and to be able to give us more flexibility. You will hear me speak later to the discussions we have been having with the International Monetary Fund under our Enhanced Fund Program, Fund Facility. And I'll speak more about it later, but suffice it to say that we are pretty much satisfied that we have settled on a figure of augmentation of 200 million Barbados dollars for the Enhanced Fund Facility on top of the 440 million Barbados that was the original program. What that means, and they have given us the flexibility of treating it first as reserve cover, but using it also for budgetary support should we need to do so later, and I will talk about that later. But the bold result of that is that on top of the $1.56 billion, Mr. Speaker, we are likely to be able to have access within the next 4 to 8 weeks, a sum of 360 million Barbados dollars, making sure that we move from 5.5 months of import cover to literally, Mr. Speaker, about 27 weeks, which is the equivalent of 6.5 months roughly, almost 7 months of import cover, 6 months and 3 weeks. Mr. Speaker, I wish we didn't have to face this crisis, but if we have to face it, I'm glad we are facing it with the reserve cover that we have, and that is the first point from which we can now launch whatever we have to do to be able to protect the Barbadian economy. I had the good fortune of speaking with the former Prime Minister, Mr. Arthur, earlier this week, as have my advisors, and he too, I think, would have advised us that we are doing the right thing by putting aside at least $500 million of reserve cover. It is more likely to be closer to 700 million, quite frankly, in order to be able to allow us to get through this part without having the difficulties that were associated with the last few years, where because of the incapacity to be able to have sufficient reserves, that contributed significantly to the downgrades, along with the awful fiscal situation that attended the affairs of Barbados for too long before. So that, Mr. Speaker, that is one aspect of it. But in addition to that, we also face this moment with significantly reduced debt. And one of the problems that the region faces, in addition to the pandemic, in addition to the climate crisis, is that generally speaking, the Caribbean region still has one of the highest debt levels, associated also with chronic low growth over the course of the last 2 to 3 decades. Mr. Speaker, I've said it so often that many can repeat it without my talking about it. We went from 176% debt to GDP ratio to where it stands today at 118.8%. And we remain committed to bringing down our debt by 2033 to the 60% debt to GDP ratio that we have told the world that we are committed to. Indeed, there are many countries now who are rushing to try and find some modalities for restructuring because they need the fiscal space to be able to confront what we are now confronting with this pandemic. And many of the countries, sir, all accept that cash is king now, but all accept that in order to access a lot of cash, they need to be able to have the fiscal space and the debt space. And many of them are not in as strong a position to be able to meet these conditions as they would like. I regret that we are facing this crisis, sir, but I feel comforted that we face it with the level of debt that we now have as compared to the level of debt that we had 18 months ago at 176% of what this whole society earns and produces on an annual basis. Mr. Speaker, sir, in order to be able to bring down that debt, our Economic Recovery and Transformation Program committed to running a primary fiscal surplus last year in our first year, full year, as a government of 3.5%, or roughly 366 million. And what does that fancy language really mean? On the fiscal side, the primary balance is simply the difference between government's revenues and government's expenditures, but excluding the interest payments. And it is a measure of the fundamental sustainability of government's finances, removing from the assessment interest payments, as these are the results of debt acquired in previous years behind us. and are totally, therefore, unrelated to the current fiscal position. So that when we use this fancy language, what we're really saying is that we are managing our affairs in such a way as to be able to pay down our debt year by year, as opposed to managing our affairs where we were running deficits year after year after year after year after year, as was happening, and debt is simply accumulated deficits. Debt is simply accumulated deficits. So when I talk to you about the Barbadian way, and I've said it too often, but I remind us because there are times like this that we need to remember what we are capable of and what we can do. Between 1955 and 2007, the member for Christchurch, East Central's paper remains as a seminal document in the management of Barbados' economic affairs in that lost decade, pointing out to the fact that between 1955 and 2007, we ran a fiscal current account deficit only 5 times, but never 2 consecutive years, and never more than $20 million in any one year. Never sufficient to destabilize the country. But by running a sustained fiscal deficit from 2008 to 2018, it meant that the debt skyrocketed and almost looked like a vertical climb on a mountain. Mr. Speaker, sir, this year, the appropriation accounts will reflect that the government, even in the midst of all that is happening in this month of March, the final month of the fiscal year 2019-2020, will do its best to hit the revised target of 6%, recognizing that the last 6 weeks have been difficult, but in particular the last 2 weeks with respect to cash flow of enterprises in this country, and that constraint on the part of enterprises is likely to have an impact on government's revenues before the end of this month and the end of this fiscal year. But we are relatively confident. Today, as I speak to you, with just 11 days to go to the end of this fiscal year, we are recording a primary surplus of 5.7%, or $597.5 million, well on the path to hitting it. But it is at that point that we will soon start to deviate, because there is no glory in hitting targets and people suffering. There is no glory in telling people that you've passed an exam and people can't eat. There is no glory in being viewed as stellar and human pain and suffering is about to ensue in too many of our households and families. We have benefited through our discipline over the course of the last 22 months by seeing that after 24 downgrades in the 10 years that ensued before, Barbados has been upgraded on a number of occasions by all concerned who are involved in the issue of ranking and rating of credit for governments. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, I did not mention just now that with respect to our own debt situation, our debt is so now trading at a premium that in spite of the fact that we restructured our external debt less than 6 months ago, there is now a bounty, a premium for Barbados' external government paper in the markets outside. There can be no greater statement of confidence in the trajectory in which we were heading and in the manner in which we have been managing our affairs. That people believe that even though this government had to default and to restructure its debt, we still want to hold the paper issued, the debt issued by Barbados, because we have confidence in the future of Barbados and in the management of Barbados by this government. Mr. Speaker, these things are important for us to remember because, in a very real sense, we've been back to the finish line, to the starting point. And we've been sent back to the starting point to start to run the race all over again. And it is therefore important for me to share with you and the people of this nation that having done it once, we can do it again. Having done it once, we can do it again. And I agree, as my colleagues are echoing, much better this time around. The reality is that we would have expected real economic growth to come in this year. Why? Because there were signs of positive growth in the second half of 2019. The tourism sector had expanded by around 3%, reflecting our sustained marketing efforts in Barbados' key source markets, along with increased airlift capacity. And then came COVID-19. Our food output increased by about 3% despite the persistent drought conditions, which suppressed production in other non-sugar agriculture outputs such as chicken and milk production. There has been increased construction activity on small projects and other medium-scale commercial ventures, partially offset the fact that we had not yet started the major tourism projects, tourism-related projects, many of which were due to start this year, and some of which we still anticipate will start this year. The below-average rainfall in the latter half of the year resulted in price increases in agricultural produce, while the impact of the sargassum weed, to which I earlier referred, constrained fish catches, regrettably, for the fishermen of this country. These developments would have led to a modest rise in inflation of 4.1%. As I mentioned earlier, sir, the government fiscal operations, therefore, for the first 11 months of this year, resulted in a primary surplus of 5.7%. Don't get frightened. I have bad sinuses today. It's called Sahara dust. And I'm far enough from my friend here. And in any event, I'm told by the Minister of Health that COVID-19 doesn't have a runny nose as one of the symptoms. Is that true? In respect to the revenue, Mr. Speaker, for the first 11 months of this year, the total revenue amounted to just over $2.6 billion, $91 million more than the year before, than the first 11 months of the year before. In last year's budget, we deliberately chose to be able to close and to be able to move to the point where we could have the kind of flexibility that we wanted to, shifting the burden of taxation away from those who were working, especially those on lower incomes, towards those with the most valuable homes and largest lands. The shift has been successful. The truth is that persons earning under $35,000, between $25,000 and $35,000, are still expecting to claim the compensatory income credit in the next few months as they file their income taxes for next year. Those earning more than $35,000 would have taken home more money as a result of the personal income taxes being reduced from 16% to 12.5% after the first $25,000 is accounted for. And then again in January of this year, 2 months ago, the top tax rate fell from 33.5% to 28.5%. We did this conscious also that the reduction in corporate taxes, tax rates from 30% to 5.5% for domestic companies, and an increase for international companies from 0.25% to 5.5% down to 1%, had effectively been the only way out for us after the last government committed to the OECD and the European Union that there would be convergence between the domestic and the international business sector. In a sense, our hands therefore were limited at the corporate level, and we felt that we were not prepared to lower corporation tax rates without also being able to lower the income tax rates for ordinary workers in this country. You will recall, sir, that when we did that, we remained adamant that there were some fees and taxes that we would have to cover. And relatively speaking, we have done so. And those fees or levies, like the health service levy, have performed well thus far at just over $5 million a month in intake. And the garbage and sewage contribution fee, from which the Sanitation Services Authority and the Barbados Water Authority both benefit without having to receive subventions from central government to be able to meet their operational needs. Mr. Speaker, equally, indirect tax revenues have continued to improve. There was a $40.3 million improvement in the value-added taxes. And that helped offset the reduction in intake for corporation taxes. The bottom line also is that our property taxes improved by $54 million, a necessary adjustment, as I said, because of the shift away from taxation on work to taxation on assets and taxation on transactions, land taxes, VAT, excise taxes, import duties, etc. We kept the foreign exchange fee from the last government, but we capped it. And we also, in this year, benefited from improved non-tax revenue as a result of the receipt of just about $11 or $12 million with respect to the signature bonus for the oil and gas contract that we have with BHP Billiton for the blocks of Barbados. Mr. Speaker, with respect to the expenditure, the government's expenditure for the first 11 months of this year has also been less than it was in the previous year. And that was necessary in order for us to be able to make the adjustments and to create the space that we needed to. This saving was not only as a result of a reduction in wages and salaries. Regrettably, there were some layoffs that did not exceed 1,100, I'm told, or 1,200, sorry, a year ago. But equally, there was a 5% increase in public service salaries in circumstances where public servants had not received an increase in over 8 years. We also, Mr. Speaker, would have seen government, in spite of the reduction in expenditure, spending to purchase 29 new garbage trucks. And the member for St. Michael East has taken a lot of lashes, but many have not praised them now that the garbage trucks are working across Barbados. The truth is, that we would have loved to have been in a position to add to those numbers because the country had not purchased garbage trucks for more than 10 years. And it is still our intention, when we can afford, to be able to buy a few more each time as we can afford to do so. Similarly, we also would have opened a 24-hour polyclinic at the Sir Winston Scott facility. And I want to say to the member for the city of Bridgetown, who I will come to otherwise praise for his manful handling of Barbados's management of this pandemic, that he and I both know, as town people, the difference that that has made to the lives of so many people who can now go with their children or their mother or their father or themselves at night to be able to see the doctor rather than having to default from going to work, lose a day's pay, just because they needed to go and get medical attention. These are the kinds of things. We don't have everything that we want, but when we make interventions that can make people's lives better and cause people to sleep easier at night, this is what we were elected to do on behalf of the people of this nation. We hope that at some point we will be able to resume our intention to be able to move to the David Thompson Polyclinic. But clearly, that has been overtaken by the exigencies of the moment, which is our ability to build hospital capacity in order to be able to fight off the worst aspects of this pandemic. And there are so many things changing on a daily basis that we have to be able to manage it and to be flexible enough to respond to the changes. Similarly, we have spent $24 million to purchase buses that have not yet arrived, but we've paid for them. And the member for Christchurch West will remind persons that, subject to the supply and logistical considerations and the own similar shutdown in China, we would have expected to have received these buses in May to June. But given all that is happening, we are now awaiting when they will be delivered to this nation, given the shutdowns that we have seen across borders. We have continued to see an aggressive program, and we are going to build on top of that as part of our domestic capital program to help stabilize this economy with respect to water, the replacement of mains, the continued fixing almost every other day of burst mains in this country, with non-revenue water as high as 50% in some districts, or higher in others. And why? Because our distributive capacity is resting upon mains that were put down by the British government more than 120 years ago in some instances, and which can no longer carry the pressure. And in particular, when we replace in one section and the pressure increases, that concomitantly leads to bursts in another section. So you are continuously playing catch up. And I make the point that when the British government laid these mains in the Caribbean, Mr. Speaker, they had an empire, but we simply have a country today. And out of that country, we must now ensure over the next 25 years that the people of this nation provide as a matter of priority the stability of water, which in my view is the new oil of the 21st century. As it matters, as it relates to arrears, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member for Christchurch East, who has now known what it is to be on call. He wasn't a doctor, but he is on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as the minister responsible for the Barbados Water Authority. I'll come also to that later when we come to the measures. Between April 2019 and January 2020, my government paid $145 million in VAT, income and corporation taxes, tax refunds, that the government owed, bringing the total amount of arrears paid since 2017-18 by this government to $1.1 billion, effectively eliminating over 85% of the arrears accumulated during the period 2008 to 2017, especially from VAT, income tax, and corporation tax refunds. I want to repeat myself. By paying that $145 million in this fiscal year in VAT refunds, income tax refunds, corporation tax refunds, this government has paid back since May 28, 2018, almost $1.1 billion to Barbadian companies and Barbadian citizens. Monies owed to them over a decade, easing them. We still owe $163 million in central government arrears. And we still are committed to paying it. State-owned enterprises, separate from the central government, repaid and cleared $145 million in arrears during this fiscal year, reducing the amount that is owed to just about $49 million. And if I can remind you, at the start of the BERT program, the state-owned enterprises of Barbados owed $755 million. Mr. Speaker, you now see why I say that 2/3 of the way down the track, we get told that we're going to start the race again?
Sisyphus.
Go start the race again. I don't want to call it Sisyphus because Sisyphus would suggest that we would never finish the task. But I know that we can. It just means that while people in our part of the world are supposed to be built for sprints, we have now seriously to be built for marathons. And it just means that when I said to you, stay the course, I didn't know how prescient I was being about the fact that we truly have to stay the course, truly, to be able to carry our people where we need to go in this volatile global environment. Mr. Speaker, we are now facing an external shock that we must adjust to. And in a very real sense, these estimates that we approve today will be a marker. In every previous year, a Minister of Finance would have stood at this podium, wrapping up a second reading speech on the Appropriations Bill, knowing full well that you could plan and you could act upon what Parliament votes for us to spend and what Parliament anticipates for us to earn as revenue. But I feel unique in this position at this podium today in this chamber. Not because I am a woman holding this position, which would have caused me to feel unique usually anyhow, but because I now face a situation as Minister of Finance, ably supported by the members for Christchurch East Central and the members for St. Michael South Central, in trying to chart this country's way, along with the efforts of a small but absolutely dedicated team of officials in the budget section, in the Ministry of Finance, who work beyond the call of duty, even with all this confusion, to put us where we are. The Permanent Secretary and the DPSs. The Director of Finance and Economic Affairs, as unflappable as he remains against any crisis and any challenge. The advisors that I am happy to have appointed and happy to have at my side, because without them, this country would have been the poorer for managing the last 22 months and would be even poorer to manage the future. And I refer specifically, of course, to Dr. Maskell, Professor Passad, and of course, Dr. Greenidge in the economic team. Happy to have been anchored by Mrs. Thorrington Powlett, one of this country's preeminent permanent secretaries who we were able to bring back to be able to help us through this difficult time. And Mr. Speaker, I say so because if the time comes for me to reach out across wherever, however, I am going to call on any and every possible Barbadian, including the leader of the opposition and others in other parties. Because in this going down, whatever it takes to stabilize this country and to allow it to grow again, we shall do. You know, Mr. Speaker, we had expected that this economy would grow at least by 1.5% this year. And I was cautiously more optimistic. And thus far, I've been right on a number of figures and predictions, so much so that I think some of the members of the economic team owe me something, and I intend to collect it in about 10 days' time as to where certain numbers would have ended up at the end of this fiscal year. I don't gamble, but I enjoy numbers, and I enjoy numbers on occasion, especially looking at their trajectory and path. But to be more serious, sir, the COVID-19 pandemic and accompanying global recession, and there are even those who are starting to talk now about depression as opposed to recession. But this has now changed the outlook for 2020. Truly, we have gone back to the start line. The United Nations estimates that the global economy is likely to lose between $1 to $2 trillion, US dollars at that, as a result of this pandemic. Now, I'm sure that most people in this country cannot count the amount of knots in a trillion. That's why I tell you that sometimes I felt that we were in a sci-fi movie, because it's unimaginable, it's unrealistic. Reflecting the specter of the global recession, the oil prices to which I referred earlier have experienced the steepest slide since the 1991 Gulf War. And I remember the 1991 Gulf War like if it was yesterday, because it was the first time I spoke at a spot meeting in Bush Hall Yard Gap in front of Quimby's shop the night President Bush launched the bombs in that Gulf War of 1991 into Iraq. So that for the first time since the beginning of my political career of 3 decades, we had the steepest decline in oil prices since then. And I already referred to the absolute decline in global stock markets, with a 40% decline in less than 40 days. So far, China has been the most affected country, and this quarter, China is likely to record its first decline, its first contraction in economic activity since 1992. Since 1992. In January and February, automobile sales in China fell by 80%. The Powerhouse fell by 80%, a number that you will hear me refer to later for other reasons. Many other countries have been seriously impacted, but more recently. And of greater concern to us globally the airline industry has so far been the most affected industry. According to IATA, the International Air Transport Association, and the Honorable Member for St. James Central will continue to speak to the country about these issues, as he has been handling for me a very difficult time in managing the airlines over the course of the last few weeks. And he will brief the country because it is a ever changing dynamic. But that association indicated that the industry is likely to lose up to $113 billion US this year alone. The World Travel and Tourism Council, in my view, is being a little cautious where it says that global travel will experience a 25% decline. And I suspect they may have to revisit those figures in the near future. And the global business travel has already indicated that global business travel has dropped by 55%. But that too, I suspect, will have to be revised given the scale of shutdowns that we have seen, particularly in the Western world. As far as Barbados is concerned, Mr. Speaker, this COVID-19 pandemic is expected to impact our economy through its impact on global travel. And we've already seen it. There are hotels who are reflecting serious cancellations. There are some who have indicated that they will be closing their doors as early as this weekend, others next week. They're on the South Coast, they're on the West Coast, they're on all over the place, all over the place. And the bottom line is, sir, that we therefore believe that the effect of reduced tourism arrivals will in turn lead to a decline generally in economic activity, and we know it. Hotels have to buy goods from somewhere, they employ people. Look at the structure of the cost of a hotel. They pay wages, they pay NIS, they service debt, they buy supplies, they pay utilities, and they also have to do promotion and marketing. Fixed costs in some instances, but all the revenue gone through. Other than those who may want to come to them for staycations, and with a pandemic where we are advising people over 70 and with underlying conditions not to go out, they're not getting that from here either. It is a difficult moment for the tourism industry in this country. After consultation with them, we arrived at two scenarios, and may I say we are still waiting on additional data. And as a country, we are going to have to be able to improve the collection of real-time data. When I became Minister of Finance, we had no way of measuring cash flow in government. And I insisted that we create a daily cash flow measurement that would match the fact that we have a daily measurement of our gross and net international reserves. And I'm happy that for the last 15 months, we have used it to be able to appropriately manage the affairs of this country and this government. But in the absence of full data from the sector, we know that there's a serious problem. And we're not going to stand on ceremony and wait for all of it, but have come here today to put essentially what we hope will be the whole package, but if the situation goes on for long, may well come to be regarded as phase one of the package. And I say so with all humility, because there is not a human being on any part of this earth or Mars or Pluto who can tell us how long this crisis will last globally and what will be the real consequences, as well as the lag. Because what people forget is that even when the developed world picks itself back up, the lag for Caribbean countries is significant, because you have now to wait until their workers get disposable income again. to be able to travel in a way that they would want to travel. So, Mr. Speaker, what were the